Let's see what some of these songs are. Anything by Selena or J.O. Venus by Bananarama. That's a good one. We Are the Champions. Here Comes Boo. Take Your Mama by Scissor Sisters. I love Katy Perry, Firework. All right. I can picture it now. We'll have a walkout music for our We Will conclusion. Love it. Well, thank you everyone for your participation in that. Here's our agenda for today. I understand my audio is a little choppy. I'm hearing, maybe I'll turn it over to Kathy and see if I can figure something out on my end.
Okay, hello, and hopefully my audio is not choppy this time. I'm trying to work through that. So hello, everyone. The agenda today, welcome. And today you're going to hear from the research pillar co-chairs, and then we're going to discuss some of what they talked about. So you could go to the next slide and the next slide. Okay, so since we've last met, we have started one initial briefing with City Council Committee. So we met with the City Council Committee on Environmental Protection and Energy, and at their request last week. I did a little presentation of the background, and then Iana Simba of the Illinois Environmental Council and co-chair of that committee, along with Angela Tovar, who's the co-chair, and Brad Roback in DPD, presented the 5 goals from the Environment, Climate, and Energy Task Force. And I said just a few comments we heard. There was some interest in, making sure that there are metrics to make sure that we have a way to measure what we're doing and to bring the results of those metrics back to the committee in the future. There was offers for assistance in future engagement. There was a question about how does access to the river and the lake interact with equity, and asking about where ComEd was in that conversation. So it was a good initial briefing, and we will look to do similar briefings to other city council committees on different pillars that relate to those committee areas of interest. So today you're going to hear, again, I'll report out from each of the pillar co-chairs. Next slide. So just a reminder on the chart of where we are at. We're in April. We're at the last third of step 3, which is policy framework discussion and assessing performance and metrics. So we will be done with that in the near future. And you're going to hear pretty much a report of the first set of policy work, as the second set of policy work just happened last week. And then getting ready for our June report and completion of the draft of this phase for really broad public engagement. You can go to the next slide. This is another way of looking at where we're at. And just to, we started with the goals at the top last fall, or last July, finishing in the fall. Worked on objectives. And then again, we started the policy discussion, and a step that we added in here after the first discussions of policies were that we sent the policies, we did a little survey about the policies and sent those to many different staff within the city, departments and sister agencies, to just get an idea of their thoughts on those policies. And so those results came back in, and those have been refined, questions have been answered. That's more of what you'll hear about today. And we will do the same thing with the next set of policies that we just finished we're in the midst of talking about. And then all of this, the goals, the objectives, will be out in the public for 4 or 5 months. So next slide. Oh, I guess we go right to the research pillar co-chair reports. And if we're going in our typical alpha order, that would be arts and culture.
Hello. Hi, everyone. Can you hear me? Hi.
Yes. Good morning.
Hello. Hi, good morning. For those of you who hadn't connected with last time, I'm Melanie Wong. I'm the co-chair of the Arts and Culture Pillar, and I want to thank the committee for the opportunity to present today. I'd also like to give a brief shout out to a new member of our co-chair group. So Amanda Carlson has recently joined DCASE in the executive administration team and is joining Erin Harkey as co-chair of this group. So welcome, Amanda. It's been great to get started working with you. In our last conversation for the advisory committee, we talked a lot about taking an approach to arts and culture that was really recognizing our work as an integral partner to the city's quality of life. So more than just the frills, decorative, but what are the many ways that arts and culture already appears in our communities and can be a partner to furthering its policy future. So in reviewing our policy framework, hopefully you've seen that our work to date mirrors that perspective. We really sought to seek a balance in terms of calls for direct support to the sector and to ensure that the benefits of the arts and culture, which we know are many, are invested in more equitably throughout the city. So here on the slide one, you can see a couple of call outs from the early goals that we've talked through already. Policy 11A, you see it up on screen. It's really talking to the importance of establishing resources to support data and research. So one of the reasons why this is for us a particularly bold and important policy is we do know that that type of research at the city level is currently lacking. It takes resources and time. It's often not something that individual small organizations and individual artists can do themselves. And we know that it's especially lacking when it comes to thinking about Chicago's artist workforce. So that's kind of where policy 1 lives in. Policy 2.2b and 2.1c, which you see on screen, this is really thinking about practices that actually have already been started at the city, and through partners like DCASE and others, they're starting to do, but really felt that our committee wanted to affirm those practices and know that if this is a commitment that the city is starting to do, we should continue to aspire to do that in the future. So we're talking about, when you think about arts and culture, a lot of traditional philanthropy and a relationship to the city is about grants to nonprofit arts groups, performances at large scale festivals or sites like Millennium Park that are city venues. But the city has actually done a lot more than what perceived to be those kind of more traditional routes. This includes professional development and relief grants directly to artists, funds for-profit businesses and social service agencies. This was brought up as a question in the last advisory council committee, like what can we do to expand what we are both supporting and thinking about as our arts ecosystem. So these kind of speak to that point. And then 2.1c specifically, I would use even this We Will Chicago partnership as a great example of increased collaboration across departments that we think have been really meaningful. We are thrilled that artist organizers have been partnering with each of the pillars, and we hope for that kind of overlap in the future. And we can go to the next slide. So for challenges, so these are a couple of examples of what we're still kind of working through in our committee. A lot of it is in terms of balancing the ideas, the many ideas we've had in our committee, and the best language to articulate that. How do we do that in a way that is clear? And also, when we're introducing new ideas, it might be concepts that are relatively familiar or popular or very top of mind for the arts community, but may not resonate or need to be kind of very specifically defined for a general audience. So 11E is an example of one of the examples here, excessive information center. What does that mean? So where this came from was the idea that DCASE in particular, a very valued city agency, but it's perceived to be kind of centralized, very heavily represented downtown. So what would it mean to bring versions of the services that are valued by DCASE to be more accessible to different communities around Chicago? We're not sure that the phrasing of accessible information centers reads quite that way yet. So that's something that we're fine tuning. But we also want to as the bullet shares there, like ultimately this is about connecting people to resources. 22A is another similar example. So, the overlay of our planning process has really been thinking about policies, but also not policies that are neutral to or not acknowledging of past inequities, and the idea of committing to values that the overall plan is thinking about in terms of racial reckoning. Having cultural responsive programming and education are points that we brought up a lot in discussion, but we know, again, that doesn't necessarily read clearly or is defined with a clear consensus, even within our own committee. So what does that mean broadly to a general audience? Still working through those pieces, but I think that they're important to call out here to know that it's something that we're committed to working through. And finally, content gaps. So just briefly touching on these pieces. So you see here the idea of rebounding from COVID. So that we do see this exercise in terms of our planning committee as aspirational. We're thinking about the future. How do we build ourselves for a strong and resilient arts and culture sector and broader Chicago community supported by the arts? We don't want to ignore or not acknowledge the disproportionately harsh toll that, especially right now in the recent past of the pandemic, has affected not only the artist community, but especially artists who are also part of marginalized communities. That's language that we found a little bit difficult to build within the language of the plan currently, because we're thinking so much about the future. But we do want to acknowledge that and know that and hope that that's going to be a very prominent part of implementation of the plan. And then facilities and facility support. So this is just a piece where we know that physical infrastructure is important to artists, and it's how artists develop and create their work. We know that the affordability of space where they can work near where they live is important. But it is a little bit outside of the scope of what we think we can do only within our community. And so that's something where maybe there's an opportunity for collaborating with other agencies. So I think high level, there's a lot that we're working through. We really appreciate both your last committee's feedback and the work of our team. So we look forward to how this continues forward. Amanda, any other call outs that you might say just as giving fresh eyes to the process?
Not this time. You did a great job.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Melanie. So yeah, if you have questions or comments, you can throw them in the chat. We'll have time to discuss. And next up is economic development.
Good morning, everyone. Hopefully you can hear me. Okay, great. My name is Lynette McCrae. I'm one of the co-chairs for the Economic Development Pillar. My partner in crime, Kenya Merritt, I don't believe could join us for the call, but I'm happy to be here and just share some of the highlights that we've been discussing among our pillar. Maybe just to kind of start with some of the high level themes that we've been talking about. Wealth building is definitely one that we thought a lot about, particularly within the Black and Latinx communities. One of the highlights that you see here is around creating an office that is focused to community wealth building. So within the context of wealth building, we're thinking about things like access to capital, we're thinking about financial services, financial literacy, thinking about how do we help facilitate investment across a range of sectors, city, of course, but also thinking about other investment partners. And so this first highlight here around community wealth building is really us wanting to emphasize the importance around shared ownership and shared ownership structures that we want to help facilitate and promote through the city. The second here around public financing and banking really gets at some of the ways that we're hoping to expand investment, again, particularly in Black and Brown neighborhoods within the city. So this is something that we have as a recommendation and want to give some more thought to what might be a process to go about looking into getting that public banking to making that a reality here in Chicago, and recognizing that this could be a tool to help get at some of the gaps that we see as it relates to investing at the neighborhood scale. We can go to the next slide. So one of the challenges that, and just to be clear, the challenges that we have here, I think we consider them to be so because we know that they require more discussion, they require some refinement, and us to really be clear about how we're thinking about these particular strategies. And so the first is an example, community investment vehicles is something that many of us are excited about and want to explore as a means to shared ownership, as I mentioned earlier. But we really want to spend some more time thinking about what are these, sort of what is the structure, how do we help to define what these look like, and how they can actually be a tool for some shared ownership structures. So another thing that's come up is the zoning challenges as it relates to economic development. And specifically within that, where we know there isn't necessarily a clear, transparent process across each ward, across each neighborhood for how zoning decisions are made. And so, so part of that is wanting to have a clearly defined process and one that is transparent, one that is consistent, and to really help to ease some of the barriers that present at the corridor level in terms of businesses that are trying to get going. The last piece on here is around appraisal bias. I know this is for sure come up in the housing and neighborhood context around residential appraisals, but it's also a challenge on the commercial side as well. So we're also wanting to think about what would be the city's role in this, and what can be some ways that we can encourage more diversity and also equity as it relates to how appraisals are being done, and how properties are being valued in our neighborhoods. We can go to the next slide. As far as content gaps, some of the things that we've talked about are, what are some of the innovative clusters that we want to try to highlight, where Chicago has a unique competitive edge. So those could be sort of tech specific clusters, those could be manufacturing specific, but really trying to identify sort of what those niches are that we want to highlight and could potentially prioritize as part of the priority strategies for our cluster. One of the things, the last bullet here, downtown as an economic driver, I think as a team, we were pretty intentional early on that one of our priorities and focus, our focus as a group would really be around how we think about neighborhood economic development. And that recognizes that a lot of the economic development plans that we've seen in the past have tended to focus on downtown as an economic driver, and to the exclusion sometimes of neighborhood specific needs and strategies. And so I know that that's something that it requires balance. And I think that's something that we as a team want to continue to think about. For sure, we want to continue to prioritize the neighborhood economic development pieces that you've already heard me speak to, but also thinking about the connections and the opportunities that could exist in downtown and other kind of high job areas, high job growth areas across the city. So that's all I have. I will turn it over to our next pillar.
Thank you, Lynette. And I saw a question come in from Roberto, I think aimed at arts and culture. Was cultural displacement discussed and any ways to counteract it? And then there's a question for you, Lynette. I think we could take a couple pillars at a time and see what questions we have and then address those. Melanie or Amanda, are you in a position to answer Roberto's question? And if I didn't get any of this right in terms of when a question came in and who it's aimed at, let me know.
First, thank you for the question. It's interesting because there's a lot of conversation around cultural displacement, the idea of perceiving cultural activity as tied in with gentrification in some ways. We know that it's a somewhat complicated issue, also because we have within our pillar talked a lot about artists having to travel long distances to also get to where they're doing artist commissions or their studios. So we actually haven't spent a great deal of time in terms of how to affect the after effects, I suppose, or perceived after effects of cultural investment. More so, we've been thinking about ways to engage artists more meaningfully and authentically in their own communities. How do we support artists to not be pushed out of their areas and have to go elsewhere to generate their work? But I think that that's both an important piece to call out and one where I think it's probably a challenge that might work across pillars, because generally speaking, when it comes to arts and culture, we don't necessarily see investment in the arts as inherently going to result in displacement. There have been certainly examples where that either has occurred or there isn't enough research and information to show how, for instance, arts investment can also help build and place keep rather than create new places that displace who's already been there. But I would love to explore that further. It hasn't been a very large part of our conversation, but it's something that's been talked about it in different ways, whether talking about affordable housing or, like I mentioned before, distance between artists' work and their place of residence.
So a few questions coming in for economic development. And I will say we're going to share the full list of policies by goal, right? So the structure is goal, objectives, policies. And we might do that in a couple batches as they're being reviewed by different groups, including city staff, as Kathy outlined. So we just wanted to share some of the highlights, challenges, and identified gaps today, but there's a lot more to come. So I see questions about prioritizing city investment into neighborhoods. That's for economic development, role of transit and walkability, and anything about focusing on small businesses, both in legitimizing operations or anything else. So Lynette, any comments on some of those, knowing that you're just giving kind of a sneak peek of a lot more information?
Yeah, so we do, just to kind of speak to a few of those points, we do have a goal and a value around promoting equitable public-private and philanthropic investment in Black and Latino community areas without displacement. To the question around our values and how we're centering neighborhood development as part of our work. I didn't talk about all of our goals, but we do have a specific goal around how we're nurturing small businesses and entrepreneurship, and as well as equitable development processes in our neighborhoods. I guess the last thing I'll say, just from a transit perspective, we're thinking about how can we facilitate thriving commercial corridors in Black and Latino community areas. We're thinking about barriers to job participation, And we're also thinking about how we can promote South and West Side neighborhood destinations to tourists and residents. And I think that to the question around transit and walkability, I do think they are intertwined. I think they're very important if we want to think of not only our communities as destinations that we want to attract folks to, but also for folks within the neighborhoods themselves to be able to access the types of investments that we want to facilitate. I think those will be really important for us to think about how we're connecting folks within communities, bringing folks outside the communities here, and also the point of how we're also providing ways for residents to access jobs that may not be within their neighborhoods. So I think those are really important things that we'll want to be thinking about across our pillars.
There's a lot of rich conversation in the chat that we will make sure and document or share. Getting the full goals, objectives, and policies, they are coming. You know, this is a moment in time, and we wanted to be able to share where the pillars are at. So we will be sharing full goals, objectives, and policies either in batches or as a full set as quickly as we can, because we want the advisory committee's thoughts on every piece of that. Environment, climate, and energy.
Yes, I think I can go ahead and kick us off. Myself, Ayana Simba, along with Angela Tovar on the city side. And yeah, I'll talk a little bit about the process, where we're at, and some of the policies and objectives that we have. So I don't know who's controlling it. If they could go to the next slide, please. Thank you. I think overall, you know, these objectives came from a place where we really wanted to, one, formally recognize the divestment or disinvestment, the inequitable policy and its translation to negative health impacts on residents, or really, in other words, recognizing the wrongs that have been done and their measured impacts, but also balancing that right with targets and positive outcomes and solutions for communities that are environmentally overburdened, and really wanting to call them out, right? We are talking about Black communities, we are talking about Latinx communities, we are talking about low income, we are talking about Indigenous communities. We wanted to make that very clear because a broad term, maybe as communities of color, looks a little bit different than the communities that we are really talking about. So overall, I see kind of these policies getting at the issue of addressing, at least righting or at least offsetting the wrongs that have been done through resource distribution, through risk management of existing industry, and an overall reinvestment in communities. I think towards this first point, sorry, I also have the PowerPoint on here too. One of these ways that we can do this is establishing an environmental impact assessment. Really, in other words, ensuring that community input is embedded into the planning process, that communities have equal ground in proposals, zoning, and permitting decisions. And we also have responsibility on decision makers' part, right? We need to hold decision makers accountable to make sure that that planning process is transparent, that communities have access to scientific data, that they understand what is going on in their community, how it's going to impact them, and what say do they have. Also to the second point here about accommodating climate migrants and the impact on existing infrastructure. I think it's kind of on one hand, of course, we want to focus on what's currently happening. We want to talk about what's happened in the past, but this is more of a forward look at, you know, we are going to have people that aren't even in the city of Chicago right now that are going to be here. We are going to have climate migrants. What impact does that not only have on existing infrastructure, but what impact does that also have on communities that are here? What more further displacement could that contribute to, and how can we mitigate that? Acknowledging the impact of loss of land and culture on affected communities. I think this was also kind of really that Indigenous angle, recognizing that we have an entire city that was literally placed on land that was Indigenous people's land. So how do we go about addressing that? How do we not just necessarily put up a plaque or just formally like recognize, but how do we formally recognize that and repair some of that? I also think we have to talk about the impact that gentrification and green gentrification can have on communities. And then also just thinking about their communities that land is now being taken up by warehouses or by other industry, and how do we address that? How do we actually acknowledge that and actually go about repairing some of that? I think, yeah, we can move over to the next slide. Thank you. I think kind of in that same vein on environmental justice, making sure that the city, recognizing that the city needs to formally adopt environmental justice principles in order to establish criteria and policies for geographies that are most harmed by environmental degradation. We also need the city and decision makers to fully understand what environmental justice means and how to address it in a meaningful way. I think also to this point, right, about a lack of awareness of existing environmental policies, I think this goes back to the need for transparency on decision makers' half, educating not only themselves, but also communicating about, or at least providing resources for residents to understand these policies. I also think, ensuring that community organizations and individuals actually have the tools and resources to address the climate crisis, right? I'm sure everyone has heard, or maybe has even thought this themselves, where climate change seems like a really big issue and people want to do something, but they don't know exactly what to do. So I think building awareness of what the environmental policies are, but also in the cities and again, I'm not officially with the city, but I'm thinking on the cities end, how does the city communicate what these environmental policies are? How do they make it where it's not necessarily top down, making sure that people understand what influence they can have on environmental policy and what autonomy they have as individuals or community orgs to try to mitigate climate change, and how to actually go about addressing it. I think also to the point, going beyond just transparency, but creating an understanding of the risks by actually funding disaster risk reduction and climate adaptation efforts and penalizing actors who exacerbate climate risk. So not only just saying, here's what is happening in front of us, but bringing more nuance to the issue of how is climate change going to impact people? What exactly are the risks, especially to your neighborhood or your community or your ward or whatever it might be? And what can you try to do about it? Or what does the city need to do about it? I think also to this point about holding corporations accountable, really this means requiring corporations that want to do business here in Chicago, that they need to invest in local green job creation and climate resilience. And also defining a process that rewards climate resiliency efforts, but also penalizes corporate actors that continue to have harmful corporate practices. And then finally, talking about resident behavior around waste reduction, one of the things we kind of talked about is having sort of like a closed loop type of process where how can waste creation be turned back into or I guess the term is like a circular economy. That was more what we were trying to get at with this specific objective or policy. And I think we can go on to the final slide. So one of the things that we kind of started recognizing towards the tail end of this last part of the process is incorporating water quality, including the Chicago River, into this. We have this finite resource in front of us that also needs to be protected. I know a lot of the times we dive into air and land pollution, but even though we have Lake Michigan, which is beautiful, we have the Chicago River, these still need to be protected and they are still finite resources. So thinking about nature-based solutions that we can use to address shoreline erosion, but also having a cleaner river. And then also thinking about other water quality issues such as lead in drinking water, sewer discharges, things that can affect our public health. And then overall, just having bolder objectives and policies for goal 5, which is mitigate and eliminate sources of carbon emissions in alignment with national and global climate goals. Obviously, the city is working at this with the climate action plan that will be released, and just overall recognizing that we have things that are immediately happening on the ground, right? We have pollution, we have industry, but overall, how do we make sure that Chicago is on par with other global cities? And how are we overall going about addressing climate change? So I think in a total, we wanted to make sure with these objectives and policies that we're talking about on a granular level, addressing climate change on a granular level, but also thinking about it on the city level, the state level, and the global level. And how do we make sure that communities are most protected, but also prepared for a changing climate? So with that, I'll pass it over to the next pillar. I don't know if we're taking questions right now, but I'll pass it over to the next pillar.
Let's add, we're just a little ahead of schedule, so I didn't mind taking a few questions throughout. You never know exactly how it's gonna play out. So if people do have questions while we have the co-chairs here, we could take one or two of those, still have plenty of time at the end for kind of overall discussion or back to individual pillars. But next up would be housing and neighborhoods. Thank you so much.
Hi, everyone. Good morning. My co-chair will be joining us shortly. She couldn't make it for the first portion of the meeting, but I'm happy to share on behalf of the two of us and on behalf of the whole pillar. Before I proceed, I just want to give a huge shout out to all of the members of the Housing and Neighborhood Pillar. They've been working very diligently, showing up to all the meetings, giving feedback, being creative, thinking boldly. And I also want to give a shout out to the organizers, Fran Lafour, Brianna Gibson, who's with us, and Juan Sebastian Arias from the mayor's office. We really couldn't have done it without them, and them coaching us along the way and bringing us along, given that this is a huge undertaking. So thank you so much. It's been a real joy so far, and I look forward to what comes out of this. The next slide, please. So I'm going to just touch on some of the highlights. Might not be new to some of you who do this work day in and day out, but we felt as a pillar that these were significant changes that the city should be enforcing or working with partners, community groups to be able to think about how we conduct business differently. So the first one is provide civic engagement on development approval and other decision-making process to support engagement of residents, property owners, and businesses. So the civic education on development approval, as you can imagine, it can be very technical, it can be very jargony, but development has a huge impact on the lives of residents. So being able to proactively provide education and ensure that their voices are part of the decision-making process will be able to provide not only comfort and peace of mind for residents in an area who are seeing a bunch of changes in their community, but also allow for them to be able to be part of the changes in their own community. Another area that came up were the differences in the way wards conduct engagement. And so we've been asked to consider thinking about standards for the wards to be able to conduct at least a base level set of engagement practices and policies, which we thought would be a really great idea. The other, which kind of falls in line with community wealth building opportunities, is support community ownership models like tenant rights of first refusal and limited equity cooperatives. And of course, one of our favorite topics, ETOD. We're asking, or we're stating, to expand ETOD programs that align public funding with local partnerships to achieve community goals. So there's lots of great work happening with the pillar, but we have had some challenges. So if we can go to the next slide, please. So we were asked to think about in more detail or granular ways in which we can identify marginalized populations or community groups. And as you can imagine, unfortunately, this list can be very long. So one of the challenges for the group has been crafting inclusive and sensitive language that every community group that has been marginalized, impacted, burdened in one way or another can see themselves throughout this report and throughout our housing and neighborhood pillar objectives and goals. And the other one was to require inclusive and equitable participatory budgeting in all wards. This is also challenging in that a lot of the ward oversight is conducted by aldermen or alderwomen in those wards. And so they would all have to be in line with the same type of participatory budgeting process. So we're still working through those, but we have thought about some gaps in the content. So if we can go to the next slide, please. Although we have challenges and there are gaps, we are still working through them. And one of them has been population loss and density. So we've been revising our goal number 5 and developed some new objectives. Originally, we noted strengthen community vibrancy and sustainability while recognizing existing disparities across community areas. Then we revised it to attract and retain residents by strengthening neighborhood vibrancy and increased density, especially on the south and west sides. And then I think we're at prioritize redevelopment of vacant land and buildings. So it might be a combination of all of these, but we are thinking about the population loss and density. And I believe that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Cindy. Just checking the chat. There was a comment about the connection between new development and whether open space and schools are keeping up, or the impacts of new development on open space and public schools. Any other questions for Cindy? Otherwise, next up is lifelong learning. Thank you so much, Cindy.
Great. Good morning, everyone. Mark Potter from City Colleges of Chicago, here on behalf of my co-chair, as well Guillermo Cruz, and the fellow committee members from Lifelong Learning. Really happy to share with you some of our highlights as we've been working through our objectives and policies in this pillar. You can go ahead and move on to the next slide, please, which has these highlights, some of the bold ideas that we want to put forth here. So our first is objective 1.1, which is to create a Department of Learning within the city to improve collaboration between citywide education-focused organizations to share learning opportunities available to the public. I thought what I would do here to contextualize some of these objectives and policies in order to sort of lift the conversation out of the tactical is to also mention the goal that this is attached to. And so in this case, the goal for this objective is attached to support increased awareness, interest, and belonging to learning resources accessible to all Chicagoans at all stages of life. So we're really trying to push that accessibility piece, the belonging, the awareness, and make sure that Chicagoans are taking advantage of lifelong learning opportunities. Our second highlight here is policy 2.3b, provide additional funding and services to ensure equitable access to the workforce, regardless of ability, language, age, and immigration status. And this is tied to the higher level objective of removing physical barriers and constraints to participating in the workforce, so that, again, workforce is accessible, workforce development is accessible to people from all backgrounds and needs and abilities. You know, one example that came up in our discussions, just to put a little bit of flavor to this, would be, for example, translation services and ensuring that there are translation services available to people who want to take advantage of workforce development opportunities. The third highlight is policy 2.4a, hire a dedicated city-funded partnership coordinator to support collaboration between key employers, workforce development programs, and education institutions. This is tied to the higher level objective of aligning educational providers and key employers to create well-supported workforce pipeline. I'm familiar, of course, in my work at City Colleges of Chicago on these kinds of partnerships. What we're looking to do here is really build scale and strengthen the network at scale that can truly impact workforce development across Chicago. And then lastly here, policy 2.4b, pursue partnerships between the city, key educational institutions, and key employers focused on serving communities that have been historically disenfranchised. That's tied to the same objective as the previous policy. What we're looking to do here is deepen the capacity of existing programs. And in our conversation, we've really emphasized the trades in our conversation about this policy, because we're aware that in many of the trades throughout Chicago, there has been this historical disenfranchisement of groups. So those are our highlights. Moving on to the challenges. One of them that we have surfaced is how we reinforce existing programs and partnerships that are working, but that require more resources. And so this is certainly a resource issue intended to highlight it here, because we know that we want to strengthen and increase the impact of existing programs. But then you can see that there's an additional level of complexity here when we don't have a full line of sight into what programs currently exist or are in the pipeline. That's sort of a process challenge that we've identified, or an information challenge, if you will. But I think what this highlights for us is the need for de-siloing of lifelong learning opportunities across the city, whether those are coming from formal educational institutions, community-based organizations, or other such sources. And then the other challenge identified here is how the city can incentivize or encourage the private sector to provide workforce training and mentorship programs. This is certainly an area in which your input, your ideas would be appreciated. Okay, and then finally, our content gaps. As we've been going through this process, and there are some still, and I will preface this by saying that the content gaps here are not at all a reflection of relative priority. These do remain high priority for us. It's just been a matter of time and an inability to get to it thus far. We've talked before, I know in this forum, but also in our pillar committee meetings, quite a bit about the importance of belonging. That's related to the second bullet here. If we're going to attract Chicagoans into opportunities for lifelong learning, they need to feel that they have a sense of belonging in those opportunities, that the opportunities are relevant and resonant to those communities and individuals within the communities. And so we are intending to, it says here addressed by new pillar. I think that's a mistake. I think we are intending to flesh out a new objective in order to address this content gap. And then moving up to the top bullet here, repairing harm in communities where schools were closed. This has also been a topic of conversation in numerous of our pillar committee meetings, where we even benefited from a presentation on the actual buildings as facilities and ideas of what can be brought into those buildings in order to activate them for the good of their neighborhoods. And so that's an area too where we are looking to address. So I believe that is all for lifelong learning. Happy to answer any questions.
Thank you so much, Mark. Commissioner Arfa shared some feedback that we'll make sure that we get to your pillar, and then other pillars where it may be applicable, one about language and the other about services. And then Maureen had a question about whether you guys have discussed anything specifically for those currently or formerly incarcerated.
We have, yes, we have. It has come up, and this is an area that we need to engage a little more with people outside of our pillar, with the city, but it has definitely come up as a topic of conversation.
Okay, great. Just checking the chat here. Comment about participatory budgeting, which I think was from the last pillar. see how these proposals align with CPS's existing 5-year strategy, any other early learning, higher ed strategic plans, particularly around ensuring students have necessary skills to participate in civic life, not just SEL, social emotional learning, math, reading, etc. But I think you guys have taken a point of view of, I mean, really taking the lifelong part seriously, right?
We have, but I appreciate the comment, and it's something that we can go back and make sure that we're doing.
Thank you so much, Mark. Next, we have public health and safety.
Good morning, everybody. I'll just talk through quickly. My name's Alex, by the way. I work on the Mayor's Office Public Safety team. I'm here with Kate from CDPH. So thanks a lot for having us this morning. We can go on the next slide. So we are still having quite a bit of discussion about what our objectives and policies are that we're going to suggest. We have in the public health and safety pillar come up with one that we all are in agreement with across the board right now. And this is under our goal of ensuring equitable, affordable healthcare services for all Chicagoans. And our objective is to increase the accessibility of community health resources, specifically by funding programs to reopen or open new drugstores within Black and Latinx communities where there's gaps in pharmacy services. This came up. This comes up frequently, as we work on programs that involve medical assisted treatment for folks experiencing substance use disorder. A big barrier that we face is the real lack of access to medication around the clock in some of these communities. So this is the kind of one real policy area that we have that we've kind of honed in on, that everybody has broad agreement on. I'll jump down to the challenges now. So we've had some challenges as a pillar working through these objectives. The first one, and I think it's something that is kind of reflective of a larger societal discussion, is looking at public safety through a public health lens. I think a lot of times there have been like law enforcement is the lens that a lot of public safety discussions are centered in. And we just want to make sure that as we work with the community members to come up with these suggestions, that we're doing so through a public health lens. The second challenge is, as we think about freedom of movement, we think about it outside of specifically around transport and traffic safety. A kind of reoccurring theme that's come up in our discussions has been public space and the access to public space in areas where it's traditionally been it's either non-existent or it's been there and it's been taken away or been kind of over policed. So one of our areas that we're focusing on is making sure that we look at public space as a component of freedom of movement. And then finally, one of our challenges here as a pillar is making sure that our communities that have been most impacted traditionally by the criminal legal system are centered in our solutions. And this is something that I think is mentioned frequently, but it's something that as you get down to policy, it's important to continually to bring up and kind of recenter the conversation on. I'll jump down to content gaps. So the areas where we are missing policy suggestions in our pillar are two specifically. One is a short-term strategies to focus on, we say crime here, but really, focusing on violence, focusing on things that are impacting members of the community right now. and what are strategies that we have outside of the law enforcement system and the criminal legal system that we can use to reduce some of these experiences of violence and crime. And the second is, as we hopefully exit COVID and this pandemic, what are specific policies that we have around public health and public safety that we have, or what is the content that we have around here that we can include in our suggestions. So we are very much still a work in progress in our pillar, and we're working through these. Kate, is there anything that I've missed out that you wanted to include from these things that we've mentioned here?
The only thing just to uplift, and I put this in the chat as well, is that, like, just to name that a big challenge for our team is that the other pillars are really the drivers, or contain objectives and policies that are really root causes or drivers of how you experience health and safety. And so we are going through a bit of an exercise to deduplicate some of where we've, put forward housing or environmental or transportation objectives. And so those might be coming to you. So I just wanted, in your pillar team, so I just wanted to name that too.
Thank you. Okay, are there any questions for Kate and I on this?
There's one question about mental health. Whether that's a part of the scope of your work.
Yeah, definitely. So, we've been speaking about the expansion of our alternate response teams and looking at some of the CDPH, like proactive outreach teams that are operating right now in the field. And so mental health is very much a large part of this conversation, specifically making sure that we are making sure that mental health professionals are responding to mental health calls.
Okay. And Isabel just wanted to clarify as a link between public health and public safety response, but I think you covered that there. And there's been some great resources shared that we will make sure we'll pull out of the chat and send to the pillars. Thank you so much, Kate and Alex. Next up is transportation and infrastructure.
Good morning, everybody. This is Jamie Simone. I'm a Deputy Commissioner with the Chicago Department of Transportation, and I'm joined by Melvin Thompson.
Hello.
Hey, Melvin. Did we lose Melvin? Oh, no, there you are. Okay. Did you want to say anything, Melvin, to introduce yourself?
No, just the Executive Director of the Andaleo Institute, and you can take it away.
Thanks. You can go to the next slide. So we're highlighting three of our objectives here. The first one, establish metrics and processes to ensure infrastructure funding is equitable across all wards. So we've been talking about the inequitable nature of investment across the city, which I think has come up in other pillars as well. But what I found interesting about this is that there is recognition not only of the way capital investments are made all across the city with respect to infrastructure, but also the menu system, which I think someone had noted in the chat, and that it's not necessarily equitable that each ward gets the same amount of money regardless of its size, its physical size. They're all the same size by population, but definitely not the same size by geographic area. So it's really hard for those large, geographically large wards to keep up with some of the very basic necessities of infrastructure spending with menu funding as compared to some of the geographically smaller wards. I just think it's interesting that people are clued into that. That seems like such a nitty-gritty detail, but people were really interested in it and thinking not just about menu, but how do we make sure investments are more equitable across the board. The second is it's a long one. Coordinate across departments to leverage roadway maintenance and utility infrastructure projects as an opportunity to add co-benefits such as safety enhancements, green infrastructure, fiber optic infrastructure, or electric vehicle charging stations. So that's long, but I think what we're getting at here is that there's a real opportunity to be forward compatible and forward thinking when we do infrastructure projects. You know, when we rebuild a road, we dig up a lot of it, and that's an opportunity to think about the future of transportation and other infrastructure, and what can we be doing when we rebuild a road to make it safer, to make it more permeable, or to add other green infrastructure aspects, or is this an opportunity to lay more fiber optic cables, or what is the future of electric vehicles and how should we be thinking about that when we design and build roadways? And then the last one here, ensure universal access for those in need by investing in high-speed, reliable, and affordable broadband service in areas of the city with the lowest rate of household connectivity. So we're thinking about providing more broadband service to people. That is critical in providing opportunities, whether that's education, employment, or just being in touch with family members and friends. And that, of course, as with many other things in our city, the areas that have less access or are less able to afford access are concentrated on the south and west side. So thinking about policies that can address that. Melvin, were you going to say something? I'm sorry, I thought I heard somebody chime in.
Yeah, I was just going to add to the second one about coordination, and we talk about it all the time, particularly in communities of color where there's no coordination between departments, and you'll see a street torn up, and then a year later, maybe, or 6 months later, it's torn up again because departments aren't, coordinating with each other and knowing what each department is doing. And so, it's a waste of resources, where if across departments, the planning and projects were in sync with each other, it would save the city money, and we could get more done all in one fell swoop that would be consistent with what the neighborhood development plans are. So that's all I was going to say. It's just a real emphasis on really trying to coordinate across departments.
Yes, that definitely came up in our pillar many times. The next slide is, I think, the challenges slide. Infrastructure covers a lot. So that first bullet, breadth of items that fall under infrastructure, we're talking about all that is seen and unseen, whether that's the gas line, the water line, broadband lines, fiber optic cables, streets, water, sewer, all those things. I was thinking about it this morning. It's sort of like how your vital organs are so critical, and you can't see your nervous system or your circulatory system, but they are absolutely critical to your health and livelihood. And infrastructure is like that as well. So there's a lot to cover, and some of it is like a mystery. How exactly things work and where they are and where they're located. So it's a challenging topic sometimes, just for people to understand how things come together or how they're separate, which is related to the last bullet here about multiple jurisdictions responsible for infrastructure. So the gas company runs their own lines, the water department has water lines, CDOT runs the streets, streets and sanitation plays a role in infrastructure, and there are probably a bunch of others that I'm not even mentioning, including IDOT. So there's just a lot of coordination, getting back to Melvin's point about when we do work, how we do work, but then also thinking about where do the policies lie. Oftentimes the policies come together at the intersection of many different jurisdictions, and that makes things much more challenging. And then those two middle bullets, inequities that remain in our built environment, and then existing policies that lack funding or implementation support, I think are related. The inequities in the infrastructure system, especially transportation system, are very visible, and they're also, they are literally the structure of our city. And so that makes them very challenging to change. They're visible and you can see the inequities, but they are expensive and they take a long time to change. As I hear often, like, it took us a long time to get to this point, it's going to take us some time to unwind from it. So Melvin, did you have anything you wanted to add to those?
Not really, but there was a question in the chat about why aren't those multiple jurisdictions an opportunity rather than a challenge. And I completely agree. You know, we've heard that certain roads are owned by IDOT, the Illinois Department of Transportation. And so it's almost like a taboo that, you know, there's nothing that can be done when it's really, okay, those streets may be owned by that entity, but those entities are part of the neighborhood fabric. So there should be an opportunity instead of it being a barrier. And I think that's very important.
Yeah, I would agree. I do think it's an opportunity for deepening collaboration, but it's like you have to work through the challenges that are there to get to the opportunity
Sure.
point.
Yeah, it's not easy. It's not easy,
Yeah, right.
but
Exactly.
it's a common theme whenever you're talking about changing things in communities, and you always hear this, you know, standard line. Well, we don't really have jurisdiction over that because it's not owned by the city. And okay, all right. When do we peel the onion and get to the core of that?
Right. And I think this is acknowledging that in our pillar, this has come up a lot, that it just makes things more difficult when we're thinking about how to change things and moving forward. But I don't think it should be, I don't think what we're saying is that it's insurmountable. It's just, it needs to be acknowledged as a challenge. And then the next slide is about the gaps. So this has been a gap that we've identified from the beginning, that parks and are finding themselves in multiple pillars. So we're looking at parks, open space, green infrastructure, more of an emphasis on the green infrastructure and the connections to parks, but want to keep highlighting that that parks are a critical part of infrastructure, but aren't addressed as such in our pillar. We're looking more at the connections and the green infrastructure opportunities. We do have a pillar member who works for CDA, the Department of Aviation, and it's been a really great perspective to have. So not only about the critical importance of our airports and getting people and goods all over the world, but thinking more deeply about how the people who work at those airports get to and from the airport and what that experience is like, which has been an interesting part of the conversation. Same thing with the port. We have a world-class port right here in the city, and I think we often don't think about it in our daily lives. But again, when thinking about how, particularly with the port, how goods get around, it's a critical piece of our infrastructure, and we want to make sure we're doing justice to the airports and the water port. And then broadband. So there are a few people on our pillar who are really interested in broadband. It overlaps with some of what Mark was talking about with lifelong learning, but it's an area that, again, thinking about my analogy with the circulatory system, it's something that you don't see and think of in terms of like, how does this work? How does this go from point A to point B? But it's really critical and seems very critical to the future of our city. And then one more thing that I wanted to add, I know there's been some discussion of the HREIA, the Health and Racial Equity Impact Analysis, and I would be remiss if I didn't bring this up on behalf of our pillar, that racial inequity, as it does in all the pillars, comes up all the time in our pillar, and we've had some very interesting conversations and debates about how structural racism shows up in our policies here as part of We Will and in our objectives, et cetera. And we did talk about the HREIA, and we did do an exercise related to HREIA in one of our meetings, but there was some consternation about why it wasn't more fundamental and not why it wasn't brought up earlier in the process. It was brought up midway. And then since then, we haven't really had a clear sense of closure on how the HREIA is going to be fully incorporated into We Will. And so I offer that just as, I think across the board, it's been a huge topic in our pillar. I assume it's come up in other pillars. And I think it needs to be addressed across the board as part of We Will. And I think it probably will be But I want to just voice on behalf of our pillar that that's been really important, and we want to make sure that it's dealt with the right way.
And I'll just add to that. I mean, we just haven't gotten satisfactory answers as to why we're not in lockstep with equity impact assessments. It should be the baseline we should be following. And so in order for us to move more efficiently to get from objective to policies, I'm a bit bewildered by why that isn't happening, particularly when you're talking about parks and broadband. I remember seeing a presentation that Commissioner Biaggi did about the value to property around parks, and how great parks and great maintenance of parks actually increase the value of neighborhood property in and around those parks. And in Black and Latino areas, that's critical when you're talking about appraisals and all these things. And so, you know, that equity impact assessment would be vital to set as a baseline for both parks and broadband, because broadband is the new 21st century road to building wealth. If everything is online, communities of color need to have access to that to start their own businesses, to you know, engage in e-commerce and all the things, the tools, the pick and shovels that they'll need to create their own economy. And so an equity impact assessment would be, again, the baseline to making sure that we're going down the right road. So I just really think that the city and everyone should, you know, really look back and see how we can weave this equity impact assessment. I even got a report in our community back in 2016 by the Chicago Metropolitan Agency for Planning that talked about the need for equity impact assessments to go along with the community development work that we're doing to ensure that people aren't being harmed. So it's been there. We really need to give it the priority that it deserves.
Any questions for Melvin and Jamie? If not, I think Kathy's going to provide a little bit on identified content gaps from a city staff perspective, and then we want to open it up for discussion on anything you've heard today, questions you have about what was presented or what happens next.
Okay, so I know you've heard a lot. And this slide is just of what you've heard. It's pretty much a recap of those last slides, just showing some of the gaps that have been identified by each pillar, right? And part of the way there's many ways that we've been identifying these gaps, or these gaps have been coming forward to us all. Part of it has been for when we've been looking at the goals and objectives across pillars and as we said, in an editing exercise, and just seeing sort of things that are missing. And I think you know, people have pointed out some of those today. So this is a summary of some of those gaps. And we really do want to try to address them at some level, either goal, objective, or policy, before, again, or as we finish the draft report that we want to release in June, because that will be what is going out for a much broader public. And as much as possible, we want to try to acknowledge and understand what we may have been missing, just because of the great quantity of work that we're doing. So if you go to the next slide, so I want to just go a little bit into more of how those gaps are being identified and where we might see them. We may have to, so there's a difference between a gap that hasn't been talked about anywhere, and I think, excuse me, as Jamie pointed out, a gap that one pillar has identified, but it actually is within different pillars. And then treating those will be a little bit different, right? So if we haven't talked about airports, for example, we may need to put that somewhere in an objective or someplace. Whereas if we have parks, but people don't see them as parks, they see them in environment, climate, and energy as rivers and natural areas. You see them in housing and neighborhoods as parks, as part of a neighborhood, you know, sort of the neighborhood park scale. And then, as Jamie pointed out, you see trails and as connectors, and and we've got trails that are both parks and connectors, right? The Bloomingdale, we're all looking at the Inglewood. So those are in different places, which we may have to explain, but they do exist. They do exist. So that's one way that we're looking at, we're finding gaps. And I believe it was Ellen who put in the chat, I'd really like to see the goals, objectives, and the policies all in one place. And all of us would, and that we're in the middle of doing that, but that will really help us all identify gaps. And, you know, I think we've had discussions with the consultant team that in some places there's a fine line between an objective and a policy. And so again, looking at all the work, goals, objectives, and policies by each goal and each objective will help us all really identify those gaps and see where we have, as Kate mentioned, and sort of the conundrum for public health is that public health is like, that's one of our main goals, right? Is to just have public health, equity and public health across the city. But the way to do that is embedded in most of these, in all of the other pillars. So acknowledging, you know, how we deal with that without repeating that all in public health and safety. Although Melvin, I think, pointed out an interesting thing is where, you know, we really need to speak to the HREIA when we're going from objective to policy. That may not be an undertaking for each policy right now. As I understand it, that's quite a analysis, but it's where we want to go. And then in addition to looking, so we have concurrent plans we're looking at, right? We talked about the trails, Chicago Connected, there's broadband work. Angela spoke at the City Council Committee about how the climate action plan and we're actually working nicely together. And so that's one where and we know that, you know, that will definitely, there's a lot of detail in there that we want to either refer to or make sure that those two plans are speaking to each other. And then moving forward, you know, how does an update to a central city plan reflect all of the principles, the goals and objectives, and sort of some of the issues that are embedded in the different pillars to this particular geography. So that's one of the areas that we're looking at, concurrent planning efforts. Again, as a reminder, civic and community engagement pillar, the 8th pillar, which we talked about last advisory committee, is still underway. And again, some of that you will see, we saw that as not so much as a gap, it actually was the opposite of a gap. It was in so many pillars, it really needed to be called out. And it was something that I think we heard today, various pillars talk about either standardization of engagement, especially at the ward level, or other kinds of things, which is something that we want to standardize it. We really need to have it as a pillar, and that you will be seeing more of. So we also will, then another way to get at these gaps while we have the draft document out there for broad input is for us to hold some focus groups on what we see as the really gaps that we need to dig into. And again, we will have a better idea of what those may be, what those are by June, really. Which ones did we kind of recognize, but we really got to do some more work on that we didn't get to in any of the pillars. And again, and then finally, again, speaking just to the broad engagement, we are getting another consultant group to help us with some of the engagement tasks. And we also will be putting out a request for proposals to delegate agencies. This is April, this end of the month, likely, to see if they would like to assist in basically tabling for We Will at all kinds of events this summer. You know, with a tent, we will of course give them some training on that. But are there staff people at a Chamber of Commerce, for example, that might be able to do 10 hours or 20 hours in a month at events that are in their general geography to help us with this broad engagement. And again, the broad engagement is also going to get us input on these pillars. I'm sorry, the pillars, but the goals, the objectives, and policy ideas. So this work that you all are doing is the base from which all the other work and all the other conversation will sort of emanate. Will they be paid? Yes, they will. Yes, both. Yes, we are. Yes, they will be. They would need to be. Okay. Anything else do I need to talk about here? I think that I've hit on most of that. So I think we just want to discuss, right? That's what we're doing now, discussing sort of where we're at. Again, I know you've seen a lot, and there will be a lot more to read coming your way.
So that's right. We want to open it up for general discussion on anything presented today. And then just to set the stage, we're working on the goals, objectives, policies for the community and civic engagement pillar that will come back in May. We're going to reach out to those of you who offered to help in between meetings on that, but took this April meeting interlude to hear from the pillar research team. So any questions for them, if you want it directed to a specific person, you could throw it in the chat or come off mute and we can get answers to those questions. We could probably end the show. That way I can see more faces. Thank you. Christine is asking, will we have a chance to review all the policies prior to the release of the draft framework and provide some feedback? Yes.
Yeah, so again, what we'll send you after the meeting today is the team's work on mostly their goals 1 and 2. For many of the teams, they have not finished refining their policies for goals 3 to 5. So that will be content that we share with you likely over email to provide updates in a Google document reply. And Courtney, do you have a sense of timing for that second round of policies?
So the next pillar week is April 25th, if I'm not mistaken. So that would be when they're freshly created, refined. And so I think a large part of this will be over email, chance to edit and comment on an editable document, and then some sort of touch point at our May meeting. Risa.
Hi, thank you. This is Lisa. That was a lot of information. So, I think we're all probably processing. And thank you all for all of the hard work that definitely went into putting that all together. I have a more general question, and this is really not meant to be probably as accusatory as it comes off. But I wonder in the thinking and the framing, I know one group shared, consideration for why things were not part of what ended up becoming part of these policy recommendations, and in efforts of transparency, which we all talked about before, have there been more thoughts on, when this comes out, in draft format for the community to give more feedback, when it comes out in a final, will there be parts that really explain how the focus was defined and why things weren't included in it? Because I'm just reflecting, again, great work. And I'm noticing a lot of the feedback that our group submitted is not in nearly anything. So how do I go back and explain it to the community in a way that makes sense and that they still feel valued. And I know we brought this up before, but really want to bring that up again.
Yeah, thank you so much for that question and comment, Risa. I think a lot of what you saw today were highlights from the team, and it is not meant to be exhaustive. So all of that to say, I think as you start to dive into the contents from the team that we'll share now with this meeting, after this meeting, that includes the goals, objectives, and then the preliminary start to the policy recommendations, you may find that a number of the ideas that you may have shared in prior calls actually do bubble up in the form of some of the pretty specific policy recommendations and pillars, but also it's not too late, right? And so we've tried to do as much as we can to take information and notes from this conversation, distill it, and provide it back to the pillar teams and the facilitators and the research team, but we're not perfect. So this last stage of sort of us collectively taking a look and offering recommendations and for input, I think is critically important. And again, it's not too late. I think to the point of, what Melvin was noting earlier on the integration of the HREIA, the Health and Racial Equity Impact Assessment, I heard a number of things with that comment. Acknowledge, I think first is an acknowledgement of sort of what may need to be more work on the part of the team and or other teams around the focus on broadband access and parks as something that we recognize as vitally important as infrastructure we want to make sure is not missing in this final version. Totally aligned on that. The concept of HREIAs as a general sort of practice within government. How do we take some of the framework around what that looks like to conduct in actual implementation, whether that be in a super detailed form, like what is being conducted, what was conducted with the qualified action plan within the Department of Housing, where they did a racial equity impact assessment for the way that they the way that they approach qualified action plan, which then shifts the approach to affordable housing funding within DOH. That's a very concrete example of like, if we want the government to be doing more of those applied racial equity and health and racial equity impact assessments, we need to memorialize that as a component of this plan. So that is something that we do want to center in the civic and community engagement pillar, and hope you can review it with that lens in mind and give us some feedback. I also heard some tension around wanting to lean in more to the practice of health and racial equity impact assessment in the parameters of we will. And so what that might look like, as you would imagine, we're embarking on this gargantuan task of each of the teams has now a set of 3 to 5 objectives that is mapping into 3 to 5 policy recommendations. So as you can imagine, upwards of 15 to 25 different policy recommendations within each of the pillars. In the ways that health and racial equity impacts are most effective, they're often on things that are more specific, so that as you ask questions that are about a potential disproportionate burden or impact on specific communities or groups of people, that you're able to be specific in your answer, because you're answering it around something that is not sort of a general or broad idea. So I think that's been the challenge as we've been in this learning process together around we will, of like, often we weren't in a space with specifics enough on the policy recommendations to do the kind of work that would create an intensive HREIA. And for benefit of all of us in using the shared language, that would mean that we are convening conversations with those that are directly impacted by an issue. Say if we have a policy recommendation on parks, we're having a specific conversation with those that might be particularly impacted in a conversation around parks. And I think we're just butting up against some challenges around how do you hold fidelity, the idea of having the teams have a hat on that is about a health and racial equity impact assessment, and starting to think through these questions of implementation, accountability, transparency, disproportionate burden and impact, while also recognizing that we want to have something that's specific enough that the team has built consensus around, that then as we look into that next phase of phase 3, so what happens June to the end of fall, what does it look like for us to do more deep dives on specific policy recommendations that looks more true to like what is a deep dive health and racial equity impact assessment? So I know that was a lot of content and response, but it's something that we're sort of grappling with on a day-by-day basis, and would appreciate, you know, your ideas and creative thinking on how we might be able to do that as we think of what engagement looks like in this next phase. And I know we do have it on our agenda for our next meeting coming up in May to come back and think with you all about what engagement looks like from June to the end of the year as well. Kathy or Juan Sebastian, anything I missed in that?
Yeah, no, I guess the only thing I would say, oh, go ahead.
I was just going to offer, Risa, if that wasn't answering a specific element of your question.
This is Lisa. No, I mean, I appreciate all the information and context. You know, I'm also, as you're talking, like specifically thinking of the fact that we're about to host our next round of community meetings. So like, again, you know, that framing, I know I'm gonna get questions from people of like, but I raised this, what is this? And, you know, I like, obviously we're not all in all meetings, so I don't know how to answer that at this point.
Yeah, and also my understanding is the next phase of the, like in any community meeting, we're not going to be able to share every single draft policy recommendation because there's just too much content, right? So I think in any of these spaces with We Will, it's really hard because these issues are intersectional. So if you're having a meeting that's like really to get fine-grained feedback on housing in neighborhoods as an example, people will have ideas that relate to other pillars. And so I think if you want to workshop any further before your meeting, to make sure that you feel comfortable responding to those or feel like there's a space in which you can encapsulate feedback that maybe what is for a pillar that you weren't planning to talk about on that day. Want to make sure you're supported in that. So I'm happy to talk with you offline too.
I saw Adrian and then May Toy had hands raised.
Hey everybody, sorry I had to join late and miss the last meeting. I've been on maternity leave, and this question is really around playing catch up. Other than reviewing like summary emails, are there any documents or presentations or recordings that I should be watching to bring myself back up to speed to where we are today? And yeah, I think that's really all I needed to know selfishly, but yes.
Yes, we have transcripts and recordings. So I might email you directly, Adrian, to figure out what's best for you. But if anyone ever has those types of requests, you can either email wewillchicago@redresources.com, or me personally, I'll put my email in the chat. We can get you either or both of those meeting materials.
And I guess I would just add to that, first of all, congratulations. And then I think maybe to focus on the engagement, the last advisory committee and the engagement conversation, because that's what's going to be, again, followed up next. And that's sort of we identified as, besides looking across pillars as a major, the advisory committee is the committee that's really dealing with this new 8th pillar. So you might want to focus on that one as a catch up.
May Toy.
Hi, thanks. Sorry I'm not turning on my video. I just had surgery on my shoulder. So but I do want to agree with Risa that I think that maybe for the disability issue, I know that in parks there's not a lot of parks have ADA accessibility issues, and I think that maybe there should be just a general policy saying that in the future improvements should incorporate universal design and elements, so that basically there's a overall city policy to help, basically address that, so that upcoming improvements all address that, instead of saying we need to look at that individually, is that there just should be a general policy. I do share a concern that the infrastructure and transportation, that parks are falling, I think maybe between the cracks of a lot of different pillars, because I think it's an important issue for, fighting crime and basically just general quality of life issues. Oh, so I just want to bring that up. I also want to bring up the issue that when we started, I think inflation was not a large part of the things that we're looking at in terms of resiliency. And I think that when you look today at inflation prices on like groceries and everything, it has a huge impact on everyday a Chicagoan. And I think that there are certain things that the city can address and to help with that in terms of like food and commodity pricing, in terms of like trying to build community gardens, especially in vacant lots. The city just issued like asking a citywide study of asking people what people want to do with vacant lots. So that's another citywide, initiative. And I think there should be more emphasis on helping people to grow their own food. I work with a lot of organizations that provide basically free, or very low cost, plants for people to grow their own food. I think that's a way for the city to be more resilient in terms of fighting, inflation long term. It also provides a lot of ways to connect to communities that reduces crime. It covers a lot of broad aspects of fighting crime, building community, and providing healthy food. I think that's something that we should really look at fostering as part of this conversation, because I think there's a lot of vacant land out there in the city, especially on the south and west sides. And I've actually done a study I could forward to you that shows that there's an inequity issue, with how these things are funded. And there's different ways to approach it. I know the city of Seattle does like neighborhood grants where they match kind of like sweat equity within the community with funding from the city to do projects. I think that's a way where you can actually get people to be more involved, and provide them funding. But it's not necessarily paying them to do the work, but basically investing in the communities themselves. I think there's a lot of positive ways to look at this. I do have a concern about always paying people to participate, is that it doesn't speak to me that if you pay someone to participate, if the funding dries up, then they stop caring about the community. But if you give them the tools to invest and funding to invest in the community, then basically people are investing themselves into their own community. And I don't know if I'm explaining that well, but I think that there needs to be more thought process into how we can create programs that help people to basically invest in their own communities and care for their communities. So that's basically all I have to say. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, May.
Thank you.
I know Juan Sebastian had a response in the chat just related to vacant lots and urban ag. Anything you want to add to that?
Just like affirmation, double down, and thanks, May, for bringing up both of those topics, which I think there's been a number of comments throughout today's meeting around things that come up across many pillars. I think both the points about vacant lot redevelopment and activation, as well as how we can support urban agriculture efforts, especially as a part of a food equity vision that we have. Those, I think, are two good examples of things that are coming up, that have come up. I've seen come up in these pillars themselves. And so anyway, I just want to say I appreciate you bringing that up too. And when we do share the current draft goals, objectives, and policies, I think you'll be able to see the ways that it's showing up so far too.
Thank you. Mm-hmm.
Any final questions or comments? And then Skylar, if you want the slide up for closeout, let us know, but I think it could go either way. Great.
Yeah, and to May's final point, it relates a lot back to the area we were discussing at our last meeting, which was about sort of the social infrastructure in place to support community vitality and resiliency and equity. And so I think there's a lot of parallels to what you're talking about around uplifting the great work that's already happening at the neighborhood scale with community-based organizations. So hope we can really double down on that in that pillar will help us shape in our next meeting. Courtney, if you could screen share, that would be great, just to for all of us to have this list in front of us. So in May, well, before May, in April, we are going, after this meeting, we're going to send out again the draft policy recommendations for goals 1 and 2 across many of the pillars of the plan. Courtney, by when do you need written feedback in the Google document from the advisory group on that content?
Let's see, for goals 1 or 2. For goals 1 and 2.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Oh, okay. I think we would send it out and give people, you know, a week or so to digest and comment. The week of April 25th will be focused on goals 3, 4, 5, and maybe even a 6. So I'm trying to think about, it's not that the pillars need that information back before April 25th. So I think it depends on when we get some things finalized from the pillars around goals 1 or 2, and then committing to giving at least a week for advisory committee to weigh in.
Got it. So maybe we'll circle back and huddle internally, but either way, we're going to provide you with that document, and then we'll provide in the email the actual date by which we would need responses in line as comments in the Word document that then we can aggregate and pass along to the pillar research teams. Also, just deep appreciation for all of the co-chairs that have joined our call today and doing the report out, the status update of things that you're grappling with transparently, things that you're excited about. So excited for you to also take some of what you heard today as initial points of feedback as well and bring it back to your teams. And just thank you for all of the work that you continue to do to steward this process alongside DPD and the consultant teams. It's really exciting. It's monumental. And I know I am also excited to see everything that we've been talking about sort of map into a final document that we can shape and mold in a matter of weeks before our deadline here. So looking ahead to our next meeting collectively, our advisory group will meet again in May, and that focus will be on the civic and engagement pillar that we started talking about a couple meetings ago. Last meeting, we started to refine even more the content of the objectives, and we'll be doing some work to come back to you with, taking the notes from our last conversation and bringing forward sort of a final proposal for it to then shape the final draft for June. We will also be returning back to this idea of the equity and resiliency data dashboard. And for those of you that may have missed this last meeting, I'll just drop that link to the SurveyMonkey in the chat. It is still live. I think about half of you have decided to respond to that optional survey. And again, your feedback on that survey will help us shape what we're envisioning as a companion dashboard that would be a space where Chicagoans can go and get access to a number of high quality publicly available data that relates to equity and resiliency in every single pillar of the plan. So we really see it as a fundamental public resource that will also help us hold ourselves accountable into the implementation cycle of the plan. So I encourage you, if you haven't yet, to take that survey. It'll really help us with prioritizing some of the end metrics that we want to include in the public data dashboard moving forward. And I'm available if folks want to chat about that further offline as well. And next May, we'll also give an update around our preliminary thinking for this phase 3, which we've talked a lot about in this meeting already, even today. And this would be June through the period in Q1 of 2023, when the draft plan would be provided and, knock on wood, approved by the City of Chicago Plan Commission as a final, as one final outcome of a lot of our culminating efforts. In June, which will be the last meeting of the advisory committee, will actually be a joint meeting. So you can meet with a number of the other pillar members that have been engaged near and far with you in this process all along the way. And June is the month where we'll be sort of finalizing the final content of the pillar reports. Our team is already starting to do some of the editorial work to identify where there's duplication across different pillars of the plan, as you've heard today. And then also thinking about the broader sort of contextual statements and maps and graphics and visualizations and images that will really bring our pillar to life, or bring our whole entire report to life. And so give us grace in these next 2 months, because it's going to be a sprint to get to the end, but we're excited to share with you well before that final meeting, a preliminary version so that you can provide edits and comments on that as well. Kathy or Courtney, anything I missed or anything you'd add?
No, I think that's great. It is going to be a final sprint. As you all could see, there's a lot of information and a lot of ideas and a lot of goals and objectives. And I just want to point out that one of our challenges will be getting this information written in a way that it can be accessible to people who have not been as deeply engaged as all of you. So for a lot of people, this is going to be like, what is even a plan? And what do you mean by a goal and objective? And to get that broader engagement, we're going to have to, that's going to look a little different than what you're used to looking at, which is, very fine detail in the Google Docs. But we do want to, we want thousands of people to have some kind of input into the work that you all have done.
Yeah, so have that lens in mind as you're starting to review the policy recommendations too. Think of your neighbor, think of your cousin, right? When they would be reading it, would they understand the content? And if there's things that you would recommend that could help us with clarification or simplification, we would love that feedback as well in this final stretch.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you all. Have a great morning.